Last week, Jen and I joined Adeline in the Poconos for Dance Nationals. Wow. These young ladies, they're amazing. Now, of course, there were some of those dance moms who live vicariously through their kids and always seem to be stirring up conflict. Don't get me wrong, Coach. I remember back in my day, those booster dads. They weren't happy unless their kid performed. They really didn't care about who won or lost, right? They didn't care unless their kid performed. They're always blaming somebody else besides themselves or their own kids. You know what I'm talking about. The kid might have thrown the ball late or 10 yards over the receiver's head. But that dad would be arguing that the receiver ran the wrong route, or the coach called the wrong player, or somehow the refs have it out for them. But never, ever, ever did they simply confess or even hint that their kid might have made a bad play. They're always wrapped up in conflict. What a beautiful sound. What do you think a dance mom or a booster dad would think about that sound? All of this reminds me of a joke that went around about a decade ago during a political season about hockey moms. You know the difference between hockey moms and pit bulls: lipstick. That got me wondering about the difference between booster dads and pit bulls. Nothing. You know, the thing that really upsets us about these moms and dads is that their children tend to be the same way, always wrapped up in conflict. Just like Herod in today's lesson, always wrapped up in conflict. Don't forget about his dad, right? The slaying of the innocents when he heard about and learned about the birth of a new king. Imagine if that's your dad. Imagine if that's the legacy that's passed on to you. Herod had allowed an innocent man, a man whom he admired, protected, and consulted, to be put to death simply because he was afraid, he was fearful of being embarrassed in front of his friends and dignitaries. Herod was a man caught in conflict between right and wrong, between good and evil, between darkness and light, and he couldn't even see it. Herod confirms what many of us have learned, that fear limits us, serves as blinders that darken the steps that are right in front of our eyes. Intense commitment always brings conflict, and we, as those who follow Christ, are called to intense commitment. We've all faced it. Ethical indecision, moral compromise, spiritual surrender. That's why at Calvin we focus so much on humility in order to discern God's will. You see, pride, the opposite of humility, is concerned with who is right. Humility is concerned with what is right. John Paul Getty, one of the world's wealthiest men, said, "I would trade my whole fortune for just one happy marriage." Wouldn't you like to have Getty's kind of wealth? But at what cost? I'm pretty sure that Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos would agree with Mr. Getty. How sad. You see, some conflicts are internal. Conflicts that go on in our own minds and in our own hearts. Our friends sometimes, and even our families, may not be aware of the battle or battles with which we are fighting within. Should I do this or should I do that? Should I give up this or give up that? We see this kind of conflict taking place in Herod. Even though Herod had locked up John the Baptist, he revered John. He protected him so that he could seek his guidance. Do you see the battle going on? Do you feel the conflict, the tension, the fear boiling up? See, he has a mixture of truth and error battling to control the mind and the spirit of this man, Herod. It's like there's a civil war going on in his own mind. I read once that fear is a sure sign that you're trusting your own strength. Fear is a sure sign that you are trusting your own strength. Herod had made a choice, and he had a choice to make between fear of being embarrassed in front of others and beheading a good man. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Sorry for the bad pun. And the consequences of that choice haunted Herod for the rest of his life. Do you see why internal conflict is a foundational conflict? It's typically the first kind of conflict. When the choice is as simple as between doing what is right and doing what is wrong, the key is that we know and that we understand that who we allow or what we allow to be our motivator is key. You see, fear is one of the strongest motivators. And when fear drives that internal conflict, problems like Herod's happen. The second kind of conflict is external. Think of the Sneetches. This is the conflict between ourselves and others. There's a silly story that is about a guy who goes into a bar. Bartender, give me 2 shots. And the bartender asks, you want both of them now or one at a time? And the guy says, oh, I want them both of them now. One's for me and the other is for this little guy here. And he pulls a 3-inch tall guy out of his pocket and puts him up on the bar. And the bartender asks, can he drink? Oh, sure, he can drink. And so the bartender pours 2 shots, and sure enough, the little guy drinks it up. That's amazing, says the bartender. What else can he do? Can he walk? And the man flicks a quarter to the end of the bar and says, hey, Jake, go and get that. And the little guy runs to the end of the bar, picks up the quarter, and he runs back and gives it back to the man. And the bartender at this point is in total shock. That's amazing, he says. What else can he do? Does he talk? And the man says, sure, he talks. Hey, Jake, tell him about that time that you were so obsessed with winning the African big game hunt that you called that witch doctor an idiot. As the disciples went forward to do Christ's work that Christ had called them to do, they stirred the soul and the spirit of Herod's kingdom. Herod's power was being challenged. Herod's empire was being threatened. Herod's grip on enforcing the stranglehold that Caesar had on the land was loosening. I agree with the scholars who say that this story is here to teach the disciples and us that Christianity, discipleship, being a part of Calvin is not a trip to Disney World. The reality is stark. The stakes are high. The struggle is real. There's a saying that I bumped across. The shadow of the cross looms large in the background. The shadow of the cross looms large in the background. I think that's only partly correct. I think it really should read that the shadow of the cross gives us courageous love that empowers us to walk down the brightest path. Courageous love like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Being a pastor, a German Lutheran pastor, Bonhoeffer was forced to choose between courageous love or loyalty to an insane ruler. He was executed in 1945 for the opposition he voiced against the evil rule of Hitler. You see, fear is the great separator. When fear is at the root of external conflicts, we end up divided. Lastly, and at the core of nearly every conflict, whether it's internal or external, for those who call ourselves by his name, is the third form of conflict. Can you guess what it is? Spiritual conflict. There are those times in life when God shows us a higher calling, when God gives us a choice to respond or not respond. Inspired by Mother Teresa back in 1976, Sister Mary began to see the hungry and the homeless and broken in her hometown of Philadelphia. And a conflict began to stir in her soul. She says, before I would go to Mass, and I would think I was fulfilling my obligation, but I began to see that there really was hunger in our city of Philadelphia. And I came to realize how much more needs to be done. Sister Mary was teaching 7th grade math. She was working towards a degree on social work, working with the homeless. Sister Mary had a spiritual conflict. She had a decision to make before God to go on with her life as if she had never heard God's call, or to give herself something greater than herself. What do you think would have happened if Sister Mary allowed fear to drive and divide her spiritual conflict? It would have destroyed God's plan for her. And what do you think if she allowed courageous love to motivate her? Right again, it would have united her and lifted her up. Well, she chose courageous love and went on to found a shelter for women called Women of Hope. Today, Sister Mary Scallion oversees a program with a $6 million budget that provides shelter and rehabilitation and education to both people and to neighborhoods. It's become a model that is emulated and copied and studied far and wide. Think about it for the women Sister Mary Scallion serves. Her courageous love transformed darkness into daylight, fear into freedom, loss into love. I wonder what kind of conflict you brought into this holy time and space. Someone is worshiping with us right now and is having an internal conflict. They're being asked to do something that they know is against their core values, and the stakes are high. Some of you may be experiencing external conflict with someone who is openly opposing you, hurting you, maybe even persecuting you. They're trying and they're using fear to divide you. What I hope for, what I pray for, is that all of you realize, self included, that the core of almost every conflict is a spiritual conflict. We all pray to humble ourselves enough to discern God's will and to have courageous love to carry it out. Friends, I've learned that fear limits us and serves as blinders that darken the steps right in front of our eyes. Courageous love, however, empowers us to walk down the brightest path, transforming darkness into daylight, fear into freedom, loss into love. How great is that? Amen? Amen.